Our beautiful CEO, what are you doing here?" Damon Reed laughed as lemonade splashed across his shirt, the cup tipping right out of the stranger's hand at the summer festival in Haven Ridge. He recognized her the instant she looked up. The same face from the company newsletter, now wide-eyed and clearly hoping nobody nearby had noticed the collision. Audrey Kellen had not expected anyone here to know who she was, let alone the man standing in front of her soaked in lemonade and still smiling like nothing in the world was wrong. He just wiped his shirt with the back of his hand and said, "Don't worry about it, this shirt already survived my 9-year-old in a barbecue sauce explosion." Audrey laughed before she could stop herself, the first real laugh she had let out in months. Neither of them knew yet how much that one joke was about to change. If stories like this one stay with you, hit subscribe, because there is a lot more waiting for you here. Damon had not planned to laugh that hard at a stranger spilling lemonade on him, but something about the woman's face made it impossible to hold back. She looked like she had wandered into the wrong life entirely, standing there in jeans and a plain cotton shirt, as if she had borrowed someone else's clothes just to feel like a regular person for one afternoon. He knew exactly who she was the moment she looked up, because her face had been on the company newsletter more times than he could count, and he had spent the last 3 days reading and rereading the termination letter that bore her signature. He had decided somewhere between the second cup of lemonade and her flustered apology that he was not going to make this awkward for either of them. There was no point pretending he did not recognize her, and there was even less point pretending he was not still angry about the letter sitting on his kitchen table. So he chose the only response that felt honest in that moment, the joke about his shirt. The kind of thing he might have said to anyone else at the festival who had bumped into him by accident. 3 days earlier, Damon had been sitting at his small kitchen table reading the same termination notice for the 4th time, trying to make the words mean something other than what they clearly meant. The letter cited a lack of strategic value and used phrases that sounded like they had been generated by a machine, rather than written by a person who had ever met him. He had spent 6 years at Kellen Horizon, fixing the kinds of problems that never made it into anyone's quarterly report, the kind that only mattered the moment a product actually failed in someone's home. He had built an entire routine around that job without ever realizing it, waking up early to check on the diagnostics dashboard before anyone else logged in, staying late whenever a customer complaint hinted at something the engineers had missed. None of that history seemed to matter once his name appeared on a list someone else had compiled in a meeting he was never invited to attend. The letter did not mention any of it, and that silence had bothered him almost as much as losing the income itself. His daughter Maya did not know yet. She was 9 years old and had a habit of asking exactly the right question at exactly the wrong time, and Damon was not ready to explain why her father had just lost his job. He had decided to wait until after the summer festival to tell her, mostly because Haven Ridge only threw this kind of celebration once a year, and he did not want to ruin it before it even started. The town had a way of making bad weeks feel smaller, with its rows of food stands and the same 5 songs the local band had been playing since before Maya was born. Audrey had arrived in Haven Ridge that morning for reasons that had nothing to do with Damon or his job. Her aunt had passed away the previous spring, and the town was holding a small memorial gathering tied to the festival, the kind of quiet tribute that never made it into any press release. She had driven herself without an assistant trailing behind her with a tablet, without a single person calling her by her title. For the first time in longer than she could remember, nobody needed anything from her, and the silence of that felt almost unfamiliar after years of meetings that started before sunrise. She had spent her early summers in this town as a child, back when her biggest decision of the day was which flavor of shaved ice to get from the stand near the lake. Somewhere between business school and her first executive position, those summers had quietly disappeared, replaced by board meetings and investor calls that left no room for anything as simple as a festival. Standing in the middle of the crowd that afternoon, she realized she could not remember the last time she had laughed at something that was not a calculated joke in a leadership seminar. That was when she turned too quickly near the lemonade stand and collided with Damon, sending one of the cups straight onto his shirt before either of them could react. Her first instinct was to apologize the way she always did in professional settings, fast and polished. The kind of apology designed to end a conversation rather than start one. But the man just looked down at the yellow stain spreading across his shirt and laughed instead of getting upset. And something about his ease caught her completely off guard. It took her a moment longer to understand why his easy confidence felt so unfamiliar, until the pieces clicked together and she placed his face from somewhere in the stack of files she had reviewed that same week. The realization landed harder than she expected. She studied him as he spoke, trying to reconcile the calm, easygoing man in front of her with the file she had signed off on without asking a single question about who he actually was. Before she could decide what to say next, a small girl ran up and tugged on Damon's sleeve, clearly more interested in funnel cake than in whatever conversation her father was having. Maya looked between the two adults with the open curiosity that only children seem to have, unbothered by the awkward silence hanging in the air. Damon introduced her simply as his daughter, and Audrey found herself crouching down to say hello, surprised by how natural it felt compared to every forced smile she gave at company events. Maya asked if Audrey was new in town, and Audrey said something vague about visiting family, deliberately leaving out the part about owning the company her father used to work for. It was a small omission, but it felt necessary in that moment. A way of staying inside the version of the afternoon where she was simply a woman at a festival, rather than the person whose signature had just ended this family's sense of security. Damon did not push the conversation further, mostly because Maya had already dragged him toward the food stands, leaving Audrey standing alone with a damp napkin in her hand and a strange weight settling in her chest. She spent the rest of the afternoon trying to focus on the memorial, on the people who came up to share stories about her aunt and the kindness she had shown the whole town for decades. But her mind kept drifting back to Damon, to the ease in his voice, to the way he had clearly built an entire life here that had nothing to do with quarterly earnings or strategic alignment. She watched him later from a distance, fixing a wobbling folding table outside the pie stand without being asked, then helping an older woman carry her grocery cart up the curb near the parking lot. It was such a small thing, the kind of gesture that would never appear on any performance review, yet it told her more about him in 5 minutes than his personnel file had told her in 5 years. She thought about the meeting where his name had come up, how quickly the conversation had moved past him toward the next item on the agenda, as if his entire career could be summarized in a single bullet point. Nobody in that room had mentioned a daughter, or a town that clearly trusted him, or the quiet kind of competence that never demanded attention. By the time the sun began to dip behind the trees lining the festival grounds, Audrey found herself walking the same path Damon had taken earlier, telling herself she was simply curious about the town and not about him specifically. She found him sitting on the steps near the community center, watching Maya play with a group of other kids while he finished a paper plate of food. When he saw her approaching, he did not look surprised, only mildly amused. The way someone looks when they already suspect there is more to a conversation than what was said earlier. She admitted somewhat carefully that she now understood exactly which file his name had been attached to that week. Damon did not flinch at the confession, which surprised her almost as much as the joke he had made when she first ran into him. Instead, he asked her plainly whether she had actually read his file before signing off on letting him go, or whether she had simply trusted whatever summary someone else had typed up for her. The question was not angry, but it carried enough weight that she found herself struggling to answer it honestly. She told him the truth, that she had reviewed dozens of similar files that same week, and that his had not stood out as anything unusual, just another name in a stack of decisions made under pressure from people above her who wanted faster results. Damon nodded slowly, not because the answer satisfied him, but because it confirmed something he had already suspected about how decisions were made at the top of companies like his. He said it without bitterness, more like someone stating a fact he had long since accepted about the world he worked in. "Your company builds machines that are supposed to make people's lives easier," he said, looking out at the crowd rather than directly at her. But somewhere along the way, it forgot how to listen to the people who actually keep those machines running. Audrey did not have a quick response ready, which was rare for her, since she usually had an answer prepared for every kind of confrontation a workday could bring. This one felt different, less like an attack and more like an observation she could not easily dismiss. She sat with that sentence longer than she expected to, turning it over while the festival lights flickered on around them, and the band started another familiar song. Maya eventually returned and curled up against her father's side on the steps, half asleep already, her shoes covered in the kind of dust that only comes from a full day spent running between food stands and game booths. Watching the two of them together, Audrey understood that whatever she had assumed about the man in that termination file had nothing to do with the person actually sitting in front of her. For the first time since arriving in Haven Ridge, the weight in her chest had less to do with grief over her aunt and more to do with a question she had never bothered to ask herself before. If a man she had quietly let go without a second thought could see what was missing from her company in 5 minutes, she wondered exactly how much else she had been failing to see for years. She said goodnight to both of them and walked back toward her car slower than she needed to, replaying the conversation the entire way. Audrey told her assistant the following Monday that she needed a few extra days in Haven Ridge to handle a family matter, which was technically true, even if it left out the part about a former employee who had spent the entire festival quietly dismantling everything she thought she knew about her own company. She kept telling herself she was staying for her aunt's affairs for the paperwork and the house that still needed sorting. But each morning she found a reason to walk through town instead of sitting at the kitchen table with the folder of documents. Damon did not go out of his way to seek her out, but Haven Ridge was small enough that avoiding someone took more effort than simply letting things happen naturally. He showed her the diner where the owner still called him by name from behind the counter without needing to ask for his order, and the ball field where he had rewired the lights for free after the town ran short on funds 2 summers earlier. Audrey watched him move through these places like someone who belonged everywhere he stood, a kind of ease she had not felt in her own life since long before she became the person everyone needed something from. They ended up back at the same steps near the community center one evening, the festival long since packed away the streets quieter without the crowds and the music. Audrey sat down beside him without really deciding, to the way people do when a conversation has already started somewhere in their head before either person says a word out loud. She asked him, half joking, whether he resented her for signing the letter that ended 6 years of work without ever meeting him first. "I did for a while," Damon admitted, looking out at the empty lot where the festival had been. "But I'm more worried about my daughter growing up watching her father stay quiet just because someone signed a piece of paper." Audrey did not respond right away, mostly because she had spent years surrounded by people who measured every sentence before saying it, and his honesty landed somewhere she was not used to feeling things. It was not attraction exactly, or not only that, but something closer to recognition, like meeting someone who remembered how to be a person instead of a title. That small moment stayed with her longer than she expected. Once she returned to the office the following week, back in the blazers and the closed doors and the calendar packed with meetings that started before sunrise. She found herself thinking about Damon's voice more often than made sense for someone she had known less than 2 weeks, replaying the way he talked about his daughter, about Haven Ridge, about a kind of life that had nothing to do with quarterly targets. It was an unfamiliar feeling, distracting in a way she could not entirely explain to herself, let alone to anyone else. She pulled the archived recording of the engineering meeting that had taken place a few weeks before Damon's termination. The same meeting that had quietly informed the decision she signed off on without reading the full transcript. Damon could be heard clearly presenting a warning about a critical flaw in an upcoming product line that involved overheating during extended use. His manager, Graham Voss, interrupted him twice before he could finish a single sentence, dismissing the concern as overly cautious and unnecessary at this stage of development. Graham's tone shifted from dismissive to outright mocking when Damon pushed back, suggesting in front of the entire team that Damon was better suited to fixing air conditioners in some small town than discussing real product strategy. Audrey felt her stomach tighten listening to it, recognizing the same condescension she had heard from executives toward people they considered beneath serious conversation. Damon did not raise his voice or get defensive on the recording, which somehow made the moment land even harder for her, now alone in her office months later. "If a device overheats in the kitchen of a mother cooking dinner for her kids," Damon said, his voice steady even on the old recording, "that's not a minor technical issue anymore. That's our responsibility." The room on the recording went quiet for a beat before Graham moved on to the next agenda item, treating the warning as something to be filed away rather than addressed. Audrey sat there long after the recording ended, replaying that single sentence over and over, understanding for the first time just how much her company had been missing by treating warnings like inconvenient interruptions. She began paying closer attention after that, pulling reports she normally would have skimmed, cross-referencing customer complaints with engineering notes that rarely made it past middle management. Damon's name kept appearing in places she had never noticed before, attached to fixes and warnings that had quietly protected the company from problems nobody upstairs ever heard about. It became harder to see him as just a name on a termination letter, and easier to see him as someone whose voice should have mattered far earlier than this. She found herself bringing his name up in conversation more than once that week, asking a colleague in passing whether they remembered the maintenance technician who used to flag issues before they became expensive, careful to keep her tone casual enough not to raise questions. The answers she got back were small but consistent. People who remembered him fixing things quietly without ever asking for credit. The kind of reputation that never shows up on a spreadsheet, but matters enormously to everyone who actually works alongside a person every day. Word about Audrey's renewed interest in Haven Ridge did not stay contained for long, especially once a colleague mentioned seeing her there with a local maintenance worker and his daughter at the summer festival. Office gossip moved quickly through Kellen Horizon. The kind of speculation that always seemed to find its way back to the person it was about, distorted just enough to cause damage. Graham, sensing an opportunity to protect himself after the embarrassment of the recording surfacing in casual conversation, made sure the rumor took on a sharper edge than it deserved. He suggested to a few people in casual conversation that Damon had deliberately positioned himself near the CEO during her visit home, perhaps even using his daughter as a way to appear more sympathetic and pressure the company into rehiring him. The implication spread fast enough that it eventually reached Maya at school, where another child repeated something her parent had overheard about Damon trying to get close to his former boss for personal gain. Maya came home that afternoon unusually quiet, finally asking her father outright whether people were right not to trust him because of his connection to the CEO. Damon felt that question settle somewhere deep in his chest, heavier than anything Graham had said about him in any meeting he had ever sat through. He had spent years trying to give Maya a version of the world where honesty mattered more than image, and now she was old enough to hear whispers suggesting her father might be exactly the kind of person he had taught her never to become. That night, after Maya went to bed, he made the decision to put distance between himself and Audrey, regardless of what either of them actually felt. He told her plainly the next time they spoke that she lived in a world where every handshake got measured and weighed for advantage, while all he wanted was for his daughter to grow up somewhere people still believed in telling the truth. Audrey heard the words land exactly the way he intended them to. Not as rejection exactly, but as a boundary drawn out of protection rather than anger. She wanted to argue, to tell him the rumors were not his fault and should not be the reason they stopped talking, but she also understood that her presence in his life had already cost him something real. The harder conflict came from inside her own company, where the board began pressuring her to distance herself publicly from any personal connection that might complicate the upcoming product launch. They framed it as a matter of optics, insisting that a CEO photographed with a former employee from her hometown created unnecessary risk for shareholders watching every move she made. Audrey found herself caught between protecting Damon's reputation and protecting the version of leadership the board expected her to perform. Two responsibilities that suddenly felt impossible to hold at the same time. She tried convincing herself the situation would resolve on its own once the noise around the rumors eventually died down the way most office gossip did within a few weeks. Instead, everything accelerated the night before the official product launch when the very flaw Damon had warned about during that recorded meeting actually occurred during final testing. Several units overheated under normal usage conditions, triggering an internal scramble that threatened to turn into a full recall and a public relations disaster within hours. Graham moved quickly to protect himself, claiming in an emergency meeting that Damon's earlier warning had been vague and inconclusive, and that the real failure belonged to whoever had approved final testing protocols after Damon left the company. Internal records mysteriously reflected a version of events that downplayed how specific and accurate Damon's warning had actually been, reframing him as someone who had failed to follow through rather than someone who had been ignored. Within a day, reporters sniffing around the story found his name mentioned in leaked internal documents attached to language that made him sound careless rather than correct. Maya overheard a phone call between her father and a former co-worker who used the word liability without realizing she was listening from the hallway. She came into the kitchen with tears already forming, asking Damon directly why people were calling him something so ugly when all he had ever done was try to fix things and tell the truth. Damon knelt down to her level, searching for an answer that would make sense to a 9-year-old, but found himself unable to explain why doing the right thing had somehow led them here. He sat with her long after she finally cried herself quiet, unable to offer the kind of certainty she needed from him in that moment. In the span of a single week, he had watched his name dragged through a crisis he had warned the company about months before it happened, and the fragile connection he had only just begun building with Audrey had already been torn apart by distance he chose himself. For the first time since the termination letter first arrived, Damon felt the full weight of how quickly an honest life could be dismantled by people who had never once bothered to understand it. Audrey received the news of the leaked documents while sitting in her office, surrounded by panicked executives, debating how best to control the story before it spread further online. She listened to Graham push for a public statement distancing the company from Damon entirely, framing it as the fastest way to reassure investors that accountability had already been handled internally. Every instinct in her told her something about that explanation did not add up, especially after spending weeks listening to a recording that told a very different story. She thought about Maya's face at the festival, about Damon fixing tables and lights for people who never asked him to, about the sentence he had spoken so plainly about responsibility that no executive in that room could match with their own actions. Choosing to protect her company's image now meant sacrificing the one person who had shown her, without even trying, everything her leadership had been missing for years. Choosing to defend him instead meant confronting a system she had built and protected long after it stopped serving the people who depended on it most. Audrey called an emergency board meeting the next morning, not to finalize a public statement distancing the company from Damon as Graham had hoped, but to demand a full review of every document tied to the safety failure before anyone signed off on a single decision. The board members filled the conference room with the same nervous energy that had surrounded every crisis she had managed, before shareholders already calling reporters, already circling the story online. Graham sat near the head of the table, visibly relieved when Audrey opened by acknowledging the seriousness of the situation, assuming her next words would align with his plan to close the matter quickly. Instead, she played the recording of the engineering meeting from months earlier, the exact moment Damon raised his warning about the overheating risk, in language specific enough to leave no room for doubt. The room went still as his voice filled the space, calm and precise, describing exactly the kind of failure that had occurred during final testing the night before launch. Graham's relief turned into visible tension as several board members exchanged glances, clearly recalculating what they thought they understood about how this crisis had actually started. Audrey followed the recording with internal emails dated weeks before the incident, each one showing Damon flagging the same concern through official channels that had been ignored or buried under other priorities. She laid out the timeline methodically, refusing to let emotion creep into her voice, even as she felt years of accumulated frustration finally finding an outlet in that room. The pattern was undeniable once placed side by side, and it pointed directly at decisions made above Damon, not below him. Graham attempted to interject, insisting that the warning had been too vague to act on, and that real responsibility rested with whoever approved final testing protocols after Damon's departure, a detail he had personally shaped in the internal documents leaked to reporters. Audrey turned to him directly, her tone even, but unmistakably firm, and asked him to explain why the testing approval he was referencing carried his own digital signature, dated weeks after the warning he claimed was too vague to matter. The contradiction left no room for explanation, and the silence that followed told everyone in the room exactly what had really happened.
"You didn't fail to catch a vague warning,"
Audrey said, looking at Graham without hesitation. "You silenced a specific one, then rewrote the story so an honest man would take the blame for your mistake." Several board members began speaking at once, demanding clarification, while Graham's composure finally cracked under the weight of evidence he could no longer reframe in his favor. Within the hour, the board voted unanimously to remove him from his position, citing falsified records and gross misconduct in handling a known safety risk. Word of Graham's removal spread through the company quickly, but Audrey did not feel the relief she expected once the immediate crisis had been contained. She kept thinking about Damon sitting at home with his name still tangled up in leaked documents and online speculation, unaware that the truth had finally surfaced in a room he had no part of. Clearing his name on the public record felt necessary, but it did not undo the months he had spent carrying blame that was never his to carry in the first place. She drove to Haven Ridge that same evening instead of waiting for a formal statement to reach him through the usual corporate channels. Damon answered the door, looking tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep, the kind of exhaustion that comes from defending your own integrity to people who never bothered to ask for proof. He did not seem surprised to see her, only cautious, as though he was unsure which version of their conversation he was about to have. Audrey told him everything plainly: the recording, the falsified testing approval, the board's decision to remove Graham immediately and issue a public correction, naming him as the source of the cover-up rather than Damon. She did not frame it as a rescue or a favor, careful not to make him feel like he owed her anything for simply telling the truth in a room full of people who finally had to listen. Damon absorbed the news quietly, sitting down on the same porch steps where Maya usually did her homework after school. "I used to think running a company this size meant never letting anything shake you," Audrey said, sitting down beside him without waiting for an invitation. "You shook me, and it's the best thing that's happened to me in years." Damon looked at her for a long moment before responding, his voice quieter than usual, carrying none of the defensiveness he had used weeks earlier to put distance between them. "I don't need you to save me," he said. "I just need to know the person I trusted is still standing where I left her." The sentence carried more weight than either of them expected, settling into the space between them as something neither chose to rush past with an immediate response. Audrey understood without needing further explanation that he was asking about more than just his name being cleared. She told him the board wanted to offer him his position back immediately, along with a promotion, as compensation for everything he had endured over the past several months. Damon shook his head slowly, explaining that a title alone would not fix what was actually broken, since the real problem had never been about his position in the first place. What he needed was a system that listened to people like him before situations escalated into the kind of crisis that nearly cost the company everything. Audrey had already begun thinking along similar lines in the days following Graham's removal, recognizing that punishing one person did not guarantee the same mistake would not happen again under someone else's management. She proposed creating a new product advisory team made up of technicians, maintenance staff, customer service representatives, and actual users, people whose perspectives had never been weighted seriously in past decisions. It was not a symbolic gesture meant to look good in a press release, but a structural change designed to prevent another Damon from being dismissed before anyone listened to his warning. She asked him to lead the team not out of guilt or obligation, but because he understood exactly what the company had forgotten about the people who used its products every day. Damon did not answer immediately, weighing the offer against everything that had happened over the past several months, including the toll it had taken on Maya and the trust she had nearly lost in the adults around her. Eventually, he agreed, on the condition that the team would have real authority to delay launches when safety concerns were raised, rather than simply offering opinions that could be ignored. Audrey accepted the condition without hesitation, recognizing it as exactly the kind of accountability her company had been missing long before that first lemonade-soaked afternoon in Haven Ridge. The agreement marked the beginning of something neither of them fully understood, yet not quite a partnership, and not quite anything more personal, but a foundation built on something steadier than either had experienced in years. For the first time since the termination letter first arrived, Damon felt like his voice carried weight that extended beyond just keeping a paycheck secure. Months passed before the changes truly settled into the rhythm of daily operations at Kellen Horizon. The advisory team gradually proving its value through smaller catches that never escalated into anything resembling the crisis from earlier that year. Audrey found herself sitting in meetings differently now, listening longer before responding, asking questions she would have skipped entirely under the previous version of her leadership style. The shift did not happen overnight, but it held. Supported by people who finally had a structured way to be heard before problems became disasters. During those months, Damon and Audrey settled into something neither of them rushed to name: occasional dinners after late meetings, weekend calls that started about the advisory team and drifted into conversations about nothing in particular. Maya grew comfortable enough around Audrey to ask her opinion on homework problems and argue with her about which ice cream flavor was objectively the best, treating her less like a visitor and more like someone who had simply become part of their routine without anyone deciding it formally. By the time autumn arrived, Haven Ridge prepared for its fall festival, the same event that had quietly changed the direction of so many lives the previous summer. Audrey returned without hiding behind a hat or an excuse about handling family matters, walking openly through the crowd beside Damon and Maya as though she had always belonged exactly there. Maya pulled her toward a stand selling apple pie, insisting she try a slice before deciding whether it was better than the one from the diner downtown. Damon watched the two of them from a few steps behind, holding 2 cups of lemonade he had bought without thinking twice about the risk involved this time. When Audrey turned to take hers, he held it back just slightly, the same teasing look on his face from the festival that had started everything months earlier. "Careful now, our beautiful CEO," he said, handing her the cup with a grin. "This shirt's officially retired from drink-related accidents." Audrey laughed. Not the practiced laugh she used in boardrooms, but the same unguarded one she had given him the very first time they met. The sound of someone who had finally found a place where she could exhale. They ended up sitting on the same porch steps later that evening, the festival lights glowing faintly behind them, while Maya chased fireflies near the yard. Audrey admitted quietly that she used to believe running an entire company was the only way to prove her own worth, as though scale alone could measure a person's value. Damon answered with the same gentle humor that had carried them through everything that came before. "You don't need any of that," he said. "Just don't spill lemonade on the right man twice." Audrey laughed again, leaning back against the step behind her, watching Maya's small silhouette dart after the fireflies in the dark. What started as an accident at a summer festival ended up reshaping an entire company simply because one person refused to stay quiet and another finally chose to listen. Damon never set out to change anything beyond his own small corner of the world. And Audrey never expected a maintenance technician from her hometown to teach her more about leadership than any boardroom ever had. Sometimes the people closest to a problem are the ones least likely to be heard. Not because they lack the answers, but because no one in power has bothered to ask the right questions. If this story reminded you that honesty and kindness still carry weight in a world that often rewards neither, consider sticking around and subscribing because there are more stories like this one waiting to be told.